Welcome to a special Black News Network edition of Bitches Love Sports. I'm your host, Jazz Monet, and I want to get y'all's opinion on something real quick. There's a potentially major event happening right now in the sports media space that involves some pretty big entities that are supposedly in advanced talks for a partnership right now. Those entities are NFL Media and ESPN. And of course, if ESPN is involved, then that means Disney is involved too. So if you're like me, you already heard about this potential partnership and you're a little bit more cautiously optimistic than the average sports business analyst. And if you're not like me, you're wondering, okay, what's the significance of this potential agreement? Well, I'm going to tell you, but before we get too deep into that, please do me a favor and like this video and subscribe to Black News Network if you haven't already. My information is in the description, but we'll get to all that later. For now, let's dive a little bit deeper into this potential NFL ESPN partnership and the possible implications and consequences of it. So according to Sports Business Journal, talks regarding a major strategic partnership between NFL Media and ESPN are in its advanced stages. And this event is actually one link in a chain of events that can be traced back to about this time last year. It was in February of 2023 that Disney made a few big announcements all on the same day. One, they experienced their first decline in subscribers since the return of CEO Bob Iger. Two, they were cutting about 7,000 jobs and $5 billion in expenses. And three, they restructured their organization into three groups: parks, entertainment, and ESPN. So with Disney admitting that they needed to cut costs and ESPN being put into its own separate category by itself, that naturally led a lot of people to wonder, is ESPN up for sale? Now, at the time, Disney said that this was not the case. Their CEO, Bob Iger, actually said, and I quote, "The brand of ESPN is very healthy and the programming of ESPN is very healthy. We just have to figure out how to monetize it in a disrupting and a continuing or disrupting world. That's it. But we're not engaged in any conversations right now or considering a spinoff of ESPN." Well, for ESPN, that process of figuring it out included laying off some of their top on-air talent. In late June, just a few months after that announcement in February, ESPN actually ended up laying off 20 people as part of their cost-saving measures. And it was only a couple weeks after that that CNBC reported that Bob Iger and Disney were actually looking for strategic partners and possibly willing to sell their 80% stake in ESPN. So in February 2023, they weren't willing to sell ESPN, but about 6 months later, they laid off some of their top talent and they were looking to sell. So if that's not a complete 180, it's pretty close. So from July until now, that idea has been getting more and more attention. Disney has talked about the fact that they want to turn ESPN into a streaming platform, and there have been rumors of potential partners such as Apple, Verizon, and Amazon. And all of that brings us to where we are now. It was in mid-January, just a couple of weeks ago, that headlines first started appearing about the possibility of the NFL taking a stake in ESPN. On January 12th, the New York Post reported that talks were far enough along that the NFL actually had to inform both team owners and the players' union that something might be in the works. And that's important for a reason that we'll get to in just a moment. First, I want to break down what this agreement might look like, and then I'm going to tell you how it could potentially impact NFL players and NFL fans. Now, it's important to know that while some details of this potential agreement have been made available because of the NFL's obligation to inform the aforementioned parties, both the NFL and ESPN have declined to comment on the situation to any news outlet. It's also important to know a few things about both the NFL and ESPN right now. So ESPN is trying to go direct to consumer by 2025, but it could happen as early as the end of this year. That means it'll be another one of those platforms that you'll have to pay a subscription for, and you'll access it either through an app or it'll be an add-on package to your cable subscription or to YouTube TV or something like that. But that would apply to everything offered through ESPN, not just ESPN Plus like it is now. And the NFL, well, they've been trying to sell NFL Media for years. They're probably actually really relieved to finally be making some progress on this. And despite all the good news coming out about the NFL regarding ratings and numbers and money and things of that nature, they're actually in the process of laying off about 200 employees. And the way their layoff incentives are structured, it actually incentivizes the employees who have been around the longest and who are the oldest to go ahead and take the opportunity to leave. So remember when I said that the NFL had to inform team owners and players about the possibility that something major would be happening soon? Communication about that went out in the form of a memo from Roger Goodell on January 9th. In this memo, Goodell said that it is time to, quote, adapt to the changing business environment, aligning resources with key investment opportunities, and that additional steps to ensure that our workforce is aligned with the league's priorities will follow in the months ahead. Change is often difficult, but it is undeniably an important part of a healthy organization. Now, no quotes that have been released from that memo let us know exactly what he meant by change and the league's priorities, but it's no secret that the NFL has been working a lot more on things like streaming, international expansion, and investments in flag football. Any one of those things could justify wanting to change their direction or look for a younger or more diverse workforce within the organization. So, based on the information that's currently available, the way this agreement would work is Disney-owned ESPN would take control of NFL Media, and the NFL in return would get equity in ESPN. And for clarity, NFL Media includes 5 different entities: NFL Network, Red Zone, NFL.com, NFL Plus, and NFL Films. This agreement works out for them because ESPN needs more capital and more content for when it goes direct to consumer, and the NFL wants to get more value out of NFL Media. But the NFL wants to get more out of it and do more with it without the risk and investment it would take for them to do it on their own. On that front, it definitely sounds like a win-win for both the NFL and ESPN, but the questions around this arrangement actually have to do with legality and ethics. Folks are questioning whether NFL players are going to benefit from an arrangement like this in all the ways that they should. And there are also questions about whether or not ESPN can be impartial in their coverage if they're connected to the NFL in this way. So let's take a look at the legal side first. Over the years, we've heard about the struggles on various fronts between the NFL and the NFLPA to come to agreements that felt fair to both the players and the organization. So whether it's situations like the recent controversy about the value and contracts for running backs, or the disagreements about the risk involved with things like playing Thursday night football games or Thursday night football game flexing, or playing on artificial turf, or playing on fields that are frozen solid, or the most obvious disagreement, revenue sharing in general. There are consistently questions about the fairness of contract negotiations, implied expectations, and the details of the CBA. And these questions do sometimes lead to racial implications because of the dynamic in the NFL where you've got team owners and decision makers who are majority white, making decisions about players who are majority black, and those decisions tending to revolve more around finances and economics than the player's safety and well-being. And in this situation, the issues of the CBA and revenue sharing come into play. Right now, player salaries come from just under 50% of the league's revenue. But there are some sources of revenue that aren't calculated in that total. One major example is events that take place at NFL stadiums but are not NFL games. Players don't get a piece of that. Something else they don't get a piece of is equity investments, and the NFL has been making more and more equity investments over the past several years. The NFL actually has a venture fund called 32 Equity to which teams have been required to contribute. Since 2013, there have been 3 rounds of fundraising. In 2013, each NFL team was required to contribute $1 million. In 2019, they were each required to contribute $2 million. And in 2022, they were each required to contribute $5 million. 32 Equity used that money to invest in companies like Fanatics, Hyperice, Genius Sports, and Noble. And that $8 million investment per team so far is now worth about $100 million per team. But the profits made from 32 Equity aren't distributed to the teams. They're reinvested for future earnings. So because of how they've handled their equity investments in the past, now we have to wonder how they're going to handle this one. We've got this potential agreement here where instead of getting cash for one of their major assets, they could be receiving equity in return. But in this case, we're talking about something that could be valued in the billions. And not only that, but this deal could potentially decrease the annual cash revenue earned by the NFL as well. Under the current agreement, if NFL Media is sold, or if control is transferred as part of a bigger arrangement, NFL players do not get a piece of that. Because of the potential value of this deal, as well as the implications for how they might handle deals like this in the future, the NFLPA is definitely going to want to be on top of this and making sure that it's handled fairly. Now, speaking of fairness, players do still, of course, share the revenue from live game rights. So if the games that are currently aired on NFL Network in the future are aired on a platform controlled by ESPN, then they would get a share of that. But this is also why it could be an issue if ESPN gets favorable deals on future game rights. So that's the long and short of the legal part of it. Should NFL players get a share of the earnings or proceeds or revenue from this deal? And if so, how is that calculated? And how does this deal impact earnings in other categories? So then we have the ethical part of this deal. Earlier, I talked about the racial implications and undertones of conversations related to the CBA and other player-involved negotiations. And the reason why so many sports fans like myself are even aware of the possibility of unfairness in those dealings is because of the reporting that's been done on the NFL via other news outlets. ESPN has been a source for a lot of sports fans to learn about unjust or outright bad behavior by NFL team owners, whether it's involved racial discrimination, gender discrimination, or just outright political or financial power moves. So naturally, a deal like this will call into question media bias. One of the most well-known faces of ESPN, Stephen A. Smith, was actually asked about this recently by Howard Stern.
You work for ESPN, right?
Yes, sir.
There's talk now, tell me if I have this right,
Sure.
that ESPN and the NFL might merge in some sort of deal.
Yeah,
have you heard about this?
I've heard
Very
about it.
possible.
It's possible. I think it's feasible. I think it's plausible. I think it's something that I don't think we should be averse to, quite frankly.
See, I thought you'd say something different.
What?
I thought you'd be scared shitless of that, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
You're a guy who's outspoken. You give your opinion about the NFL, and sometimes to the detriment of the NFL. You're not always, the NFL isn't always your favorite.
Right.
If those guys enter into a business together,
Yep.
I see that as dangerous. So Stephen A. Smith says something controversial about the NFL. The NFL doesn't like it. They pick up the phone to your boss at ESPN and say, listen, tell that motherfucker to shut up. He's pissing us off. That's going to suck.
I feel where you're coming from. I'm going to say what I feel. I'm going to make sure it's fact-based. More importantly, I'm going to reach out to Roger Goodell directly.
Yes,
and say,
but
yo, this is what I'm going to do. Here's why. This is where I stand. And as long as you're straight up about where you stand, you do your homework, you cultivate your sources, and you have that information, then they can try to stop you. But in the end, it's something that's very, very difficult to do.
Now, Stephen A.'s tone is very reassuring here, but his words, not so much. So for me, when I saw this, I wondered, if he's gonna say and do what he wants anyway, why even reach out to Roger Goodell? What exactly is the purpose of that communication, and how exactly is that conversation gonna go? Especially if what's being reported on is something that puts a spotlight on something the NFL doesn't want there to be a spotlight on. This perspective also completely ignores the fact that in the past, on-air talent has suffered professional consequences for questioning the NFL. A recent example of this is Jim Trotter, who didn't have his contract renewed after questioning Roger Goodell about the diversity, or lack thereof, at NFL Media.
One of the things the NFL always said internally is hold us accountable. Hold us accountable as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so for the last couple of years, that's what I've been trying to do, pointing out that in our newsroom, where we cover a player population that is roughly 60 to 70% Black, according to league data, there is no Black person in senior management in our newsroom who has a seat at the table when we are deciding how we are going to cover these players and who is going to cover them. And the fact that we don't, to me, it's an issue. So I have raised that repeatedly over the last 2 years, including at the last 2 Super Bowls with the commissioner. And there are some who didn't like it. And I do believe it played a role in my contract not being renewed. And I will talk about that more later. But so be it, I'm not going to change. And I'm always going to fight for representation, and I'm always going to fight for the truth.
Trotter is actually so sure of his stance that he filed a lawsuit for wrongful termination from the NFL. The NFL, however, is not only trying to win this case, but is actually trying to have the lawsuit thrown out. There are some who say the NFL is trying to have the lawsuit thrown out now before the discovery phase of the lawsuit happens, because the discovery phase is when all sorts of things would come out that Jim Trotter would use to support what he's saying. So we'll see what happens there, but that's a different video for a different day. As far as Stephen A.'s perspective versus Jim Trotter's perspective, of course, the fact that Stephen A. works for ESPN and Jim Trotter worked for NFL Media could play a role in their differing tones. But it still all points to the question of, will reporters be able to report on and talk about the topics that they feel are important, informative, and relevant? Or will the NFL have even more power and more leverage to be able to censor and editorialize and paint the picture that they want painted? Over the past decade or so, important conversations about the NFL have been had via ESPN. The hiring of Black coaches, the treatment of Black players, the presentation and perception of Black quarterbacks, the league stance on Black Lives Matter, and players' rights to participate in and support protests and social justice initiatives. So what happens to all of those conversations if the NFL increases their control of the worldwide leader in sports? If you watch my content, you know that I'm not only a fan of players for what they do on the field, but I'm also an advocate for them being treated and compensated fairly. So this is a situation where NFL players have a lot to consider from a legal and financial perspective, but also from a personal perspective as well. So all that being said, I really am curious about what y'all think, and I love engaging with the comments. So tell me what you think in the comments about how you think this is all going to play out, and we can talk about it over the next few days. And speaking of engaging with me, if you want to watch more of my content, you can find me on YouTube on the Bitches Love Sports podcast channel, or you can engage with me daily on X, formerly known as Twitter. And if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like it and please share it. And of course, make sure you subscribe and keep those notifications turned on. This has been a special Black News Network edition of Bitches Love Sports. I'm Jazz Monet, and I'm out.